who obviously weren't able to make it today. Hannah will go over at the end where you'll be able to find that. And any links or documents or anything like that that is mentioned in any of the briefings or the event today will be shared with you after the event and during as well. So rest assured, anything that you want to get links for or information on, it'll be shared with you absolutely. So just briefly going through the format of today, Sheena's going to open us up, the event up, sorry, and Sheena's the independent chair for the CPC. Sheena, can I just check that you're here? Could you say hello? Oh. In the darkness.
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Yeah, okay, perfect. After that, we've got Jacqueline Murray from the National Human Trafficking Unit to give us an outline of the national picture, discuss national referral mechanism and different types of trafficking and how to respond. Jacqueline, can I just confirm that you're here?
Yes, good morning. Sorry, I had some connection issues this morning, but I'm here online now.
Perfect, thank you, Jacqueline. After that, we have Kirsty Allen from Searchlight Scotland, who will be talking about the outcomes for traffic victims and national supports that are available. Kirsty, can I just double check that you're here?
Yeah, I'm here, Stuart.
Perfect, thank you. After that, we will have our local guidance view, which is why we're all here, and that will be given by Detective Inspector Leslie Clark from Police Scotland. Leslie, can I just check that you're here?
Yeah, I'm here, Stuart.
Thank you. After that, we'll finish off by Hannah will talk us through the training that's available to all multi-agency staff covering child trafficking. Hannah, can I just check that you're here?
Hi, yeah, I'm here.
Now, throughout the event, after each speaker has finished their presentation, we'll open it up for a quick question and answer session. If there's any questions that come up that you're not able to ask the speaker at the time, please feel free to use the chat function, and as you'll see at the end there, we do have questions and closing remarks at the end, so we'll have an opportunity if you've not been able to ask your question in the time period given. We'll have time at the end for you to ask any questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sheena to open the event up and get us started. So Sheena, can I hand over to you, please?
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stuart. I'd just like to echo Stuart's welcome to everyone. This event sees the launch of our multi-agency child trafficking and exploitation guidance here in Aberdeen City. My name is Sheena Gault and I'm the independent chair of the Adult Protection Committee and the Child Protection Committee here in Aberdeen. Before I go through some thank yous, I wanted to set the scene a little on how this has come about. Locally, we have our Child Protection Committee, which governs all things multi-agency when it comes to child protection. Under the Child Protection Committee, we have 3 subcommittees, one for learning and development, one for initial and significant case reviews, and another for performance and quality assurance purposes. We also have several thematic groups sitting under the Child Protection Committee, which carry out key and targeted pieces of work, and this is where our child trafficking guidance first came into focus. One of the thematic groups has the remit for online safety, child trafficking and child sexual exploitation. This group is jointly led by Leslie Clark, a Detective Inspector for Police Scotland, and Annabel Turner, Director of CyberSafe Scotland, who you'll hear from a little bit later. This is a multi-agency group represented by many services across the city, and a key part of this focus was to develop and implement local multi-agency child trafficking and exploitation guidance, which started, believe it or not, way back in 2019. It went through several consultations and amendments before finally being approved by the Child Protection Committee last year. And then COVID came along and changed everything. This caused us some delay, but it is with great pleasure I can now come along today to officially launch this guidance. As with many areas across Scotland, we are making good progress in the digital way of working, and we are keen that every policy, procedure or guidance developed is succinct, accessible, and contains the information practitioners need. With that in mind, I'm sure once you see this guidance, you will note that this is not a lengthy document, but rather something that is easy to digest and make sense of. I want to thank the thematic group for their work and effort in pulling this together. Trafficking in all its forms is a key priority in the city, and the Child Protection Committee has made sure child trafficking remains one of our priorities too. I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us today. Jacqueline Murray from the National Trafficking Unit in Police Scotland, Kirsty Allen, who is the Development Director for Searchlight Scotland, Leslie Clark, who I've mentioned already, and Hannah Bennett, who is our Multi-Agency Learning and Development Officer. I'd also like to thank Stuart Lamberton, who introduced us to the event this morning. Stuart's our Child Protection Lead Officer and has done a huge amount of work over the last year or so, in particularly difficult times, as we've all experienced. And if it wasn't for Stuart and Hannah and the efforts that they've made, this would be a much poorer event today. I'm now going to hand over to Jacqueline, who will introduce herself and kick us off. I really do hope you get a lot out of this event today. Thank you all.
Good morning, folks. I'm not sure if you can hear me yet. Any thumbs up, hands?
Yes, we can hear you, Jacqueline.
Fantastic. I wonder if you could bring the presentation up, or do you want me to share my screen?
If you can share your screen, go for it. If not, I'll find your presentation and share it for you.
Sorry, I thought the presentation was going to be there. So I've been having some technical issues this morning. I do apologise. I'm presenting from an operational setting rather than one of our meeting rooms today, just because my laptop decided that today was not a day it was going to work. Police Scotland technical issues. Can everybody see that now?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Right, my name's DS Jackie Murray. I'm from Police Scotland National Human Trafficking Unit. We work within the Specialist Crime Division at the Public Protection Unit here at the Crime Campus in Gartcosh. Now that sounds all very exciting, and it's possibly one of the best areas of policing that I've worked in my career. It's an area that I absolutely thoroughly enjoy. I'll romp through today some slides, give you some facts and figures. Please feel free, if there's anything that you want me to clarify, just to let me know. The most common question we're asked here at the unit when we do these type of presentations is, does human trafficking happen in the 21st century? Just to put it in perspective, these are some of the press articles that have appeared over the last year. Police Scotland operation sees 24 arrests over human trafficking. That's a live operation that's ongoing at the moment. 24 nominals were arrested throughout Scotland, England and in Romania, and that was the sexual exploitation for prostitution of females. We had a major sex trafficking gang luring vulnerable women to Scotland, busted by police. You've got to love some Daily Record headlines. They're all very vibrant. That was an operation that went on in Glasgow that we assisted with. I think there were 12 victims of trafficking there were rescued or certainly discovered. And the madam heading up a Scots prostitution ring was an Asian nominal who was running brothels in Glasgow. And we have 2 Vietnamese police officers seconded to us at the moment to assist with learning about the cultural aspects and the diaspora of the Vietnamese within Scotland. The Vietnamese form the biggest nationality group and certainly the biggest child nationality group that we deal with in the national referral mechanism in Scotland. I'll go on. I presume that most of you are familiar with the NRM, but I'll give a brief explanation of it just shortly. Right, just as an introduction to human trafficking, what is it? It's the trade and exploitation of human beings for profit. Make no bones about it, human trafficking is about cash. It's about profit. It's about somebody else benefiting from somebody else's exploitation. It's happening here in Scotland right now, and last year we had over 400 national referral mechanisms sent to ourselves by the Home Office for investigation in 2020. About a quarter of those were for those who claim to be under 18 years. I know that that's a very emotive subject, but I'm using that term very advisedly at the moment. So when you're dealing with human trafficking in Scotland, it involves serious and organised crime. They target vulnerable persons, and to deal with it, we need to take a multi-agency partnership working approach. Police Scotland are very, very aware that we have to take a victim-centred, trauma-informed approach, and that informs how we interact with victims and with exploiters. Human trafficking contains all the elements of a major crime investigation, and some of the biggest ongoing investigations within Police Scotland at the moment are in the human trafficking arena. So just a wee bit about the legislation. I think it's important they have a background of where we're coming from this. We work off the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Scotland Act 2015, which came into force in May 2016. That act lays down two main offences. We have trafficking for exploitation. No actual exploitation needs to have taken place for that offence to be complete. And we have slavery, servitude and forced or compulsory labour. That's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm just going to refer to that as labour exploitation throughout the next sort of 20-25 minutes or so. One of the biggest myths we find for human trafficking is that no movement's required. It is not. See, in Scotland, you do not need to move a victim from one place to another. We'll have a wee look at how, the mechanism behind human trafficking just in a wee second. So in terms of this act, a child is a person under 18, which for us and the criminal justice system is at odds with perhaps other pieces of legislation, but this is a message that we get out very strongly to our partners and officers. And the other thing to remember is a child cannot consent to be exploited, so if any of the relevant actions are taken, whether a child consents or not is irrelevant. Very importantly for us, we have to unpick smuggling, trafficking and unaccompanied child migrants. They're very, very closely tied up together. Smuggling is a crime against the state where somebody is brought into the UK against our immigration laws. Thereafter, they're free to go about their own business usually. The difference with trafficking is from another country. When somebody is brought into the UK, there's an expectation or that they will be exploited after that. So it's a crime against the person. Unaccompanied child migrants, that's another area that we have to look at, is where children are brought to the UK usually for a better life. It may well be that they come here of their own accord or they're sent here by their family. So to look just a wee bit more in depth at what the Act means, it's an offence for a person to take a relevant action. I'm going to keep mentioning these relevant actions because they're really quite important. It's the recruitment, transportation, harbouring, exchange for transfer of control of another, or the facilitation or arranging of any of these, the above. And the crime is complete when there's an intention to exploit, or the person who takes that action ought to know that the victim will be exploited. For example, if you are bringing a Romanian female to the UK for the purposes of prostitution, you've recruited, transported or harboured that female, and the intention is that she will be brought into prostitution. Whether she agrees to those actions or not, that is an offence. So it's irrelevant if the victim consents to any part of that relevant action for that offence to be completed. Some parts of the exploitations require force, threats or coercion, but it's not required to complete the relevant actions. So some of the types of exploitation that we're looking at, there are 4 exploitations mentioned in the Act. These don't really marry up with the definitions of some of the exploitations that we're more traditionally aware of, like forced criminality and domestic servitude. These are forms of these types of exploitation. So the first one is labour exploitation. Most commonly in Scotland, it will be within farming industry, cannabis farms. Even though it's illegal, it still can be a labour exploitation in car washes and nail bars. Sexual exploitation has 2 parts to it. You have sexual exploitation for any one of a number of acts. So that includes most of the child sex offences that are on the statute books. And we have sexual exploitation for the purposes of prostitution. It is not illegal to be a prostitute in Scotland if you are operating on your own and you're operating in a private environment, but it is an offence to aid, abet or assist in any way with that prostitution. Services and benefits is the big one for children. This is where a person is, for a child, no threats, force or coercion is required, or a vulnerable person. For an adult, there has to be threats, force or coercion to secure any form of services and benefits from that person. Now, this is a really good bit of legislation because it covers some of the most vulnerable in society. It also covers where a child is recruited into drug dealing. The child may agree to be recruited, but they cannot be used for that purpose. It also covers where somebody is cuckooed. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that terminology. It's where perhaps you have a vulnerable person who's vulnerable through their drug taking or mental health illness. A drug dealer will come in, take over their property. They may well perhaps feed them drinking drugs. They recruit them, get them on side, they groom them, and then they take over their house to cut, transport, deal drugs from. And that person feels that they have no ability to control that, so it's very, very insidious. And the last one is really the headline grabbing one, organ removal. Now this is in the Act because Scotland is part of the Palermo Protocol. There are certain actions that we have agreed to outlaw, and organ removal is one of them. In reality, we have not seen organ removal within Scotland, and it's because we have such a good NHS system. We did raise one crime report for organ removal, but it was a bit of a mistake. It was the wrong crime code was used, but we did get a bit excited when we saw it, I must admit. So children and vulnerable adults are specifically protected by the Act. It's a specific offence to use or attempt to use a child or vulnerable adult to provide services of any kind, provide another with benefits of any kind, and I must state that this is not state benefits, not DWP benefits, or to enable another person to acquire benefit of any kind. So if a child is brought to the UK or a child is recruited within the UK to provide another with benefits, so this will cover your county lines, drug dealing, where drugs are moved from one place to another using telephones, and children, or a child is used for some kind of labour. This piece of the legislation can be used. So it's very wide ranging and encompasses vulnerable adults, mental health, physical illness, disability, old age, and any other reason where their ability to refuse to be used for that purpose is impaired. It's a piece of legislation that's very much underused, and it's one that we are going to be, we do promote to officers to consider, and that we look at to liable additional charges. So we look at child criminal exploitation. These are the main areas where we have seen children being used. To be honest, in the past year, it's drugs. It's children being recruited to deal drugs and to move drugs. So that's your county lines and drug supply. In the past, we've seen children being forced into begging as well. Begging, again, in Scotland is not a criminal offence in itself. Where the offence occurs is if somebody aggressively asks for money or goods, and it comes under our Breach of the Peace legislation, Section 38 of the Criminal Justice and Licence of Scotland Act. Theft by shoplifting, you very often have family units from certain nationalities, including Romanian, where they go round as a group and steal in shops, that is securing another service or benefit. Cannabis cultivations, most often we see Vietnamese minors being used in this manner to pay off a debt bond to come to the UK. They're put into cannabis cultivations. Sexual exploitation and prostitution doesn't occur as much among the NRM entries that we get to Police Scotland. We are aware that it occurs, and that the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Scotland Act could be used more in these cases. A recent case that we had was a stepfather bought a child from the woman that he married. They then came to the UK. The woman returned to her home country and the stepfather remained in the UK with the child, but he had purchased that child with the intention of sexually abusing that child, and that was one that was picked up very, very early on by Border Force, and the child was safeguarded. Just a wee bit about a recent European Court of Human Rights judgment that we've had. Back in 2009, two Vietnamese 17-year-olds, I think it was 16, 17-year-olds, were caught within cannabis cultivations in England. At that time, they were considered to be potential victims of trafficking, and that was discounted at a very early stage. They pled guilty to those offences, but they have now taken it through the European Court of Human Rights that they hadn't been assessed properly as potential victims of trafficking, and evidence had been lost that would support their case at that time. So that's been found to be upheld. I must stress that this was prior to our Human Trafficking and Exploitation Scotland Act 2015 and Modern Slavery Act 2015, which is enforced down in England and Wales. It's a European Court ruling that we are taking very seriously. We have benchmarked against the practices that are in place at the moment, and we are fairly confident that in most cases we're getting this right. So a wee bit about the NRM process. To secure support for somebody who is a potential victim of trafficking, the government have put in place a national referral process. The national referral mechanism exists in most countries across Europe in some form or another, and it's administered by the Home Office Single Competent Authority. So a first responder, who includes in Scotland social work, police, TARA, migrant help and the Home Office immigration, where they come across somebody who they consider to be a victim of trafficking, they will submit an NRM to the Home Office. In terms of children cannot consent to be entered into the NRM. It is good practice that they are consulted and they are informed of the process and what is happening, but a first responder can submit that NRM without their consent. That then puts the child into a process where evidence is considered around their status as a potential victim of trafficking. It also gets them support, additional support, I should say, while they're going through that process. Social work are the lead agencies for NRMs, and where a child is found in a potential victim of trafficking circumstances, an IRD should be carried out with social work at that point. That's when it should be discussed, when an NRM should be submitted. So there is a devolved pilot, NRM pilot, being considered in Scotland at the moment. 10 local authorities or local authority area groups are being considered all over the UK for this NRM pilot, where NRMs wouldn't be considered by the Single Competent Authority, they would be considered by a social work department. Glasgow are currently in the process of considering entering into that devolved NRM pilot. If they're successful in the bid, the police will be part of that decision-making process. We can bring advice, guidance to the table on that one. So just to have a wee look at the concentrate on child victims of trafficking, a child cannot consent to be exploited for securing services and benefits or to be sexually exploited. We've recently had a case where a 17-year-old took a 16-year-old female to our drugs party. She was aware that the males at the party wanted to have sex with this 16-year-old. So she took her friend to the party in exchange for drugs so that the friend would then be sexually exploited. The circumstances around that were considered that it was human trafficking. So the Act is very, very wide-ranging here. And oh, sorry, my screen has frozen. Can everybody see me?
Yeah, your screen's frozen for me as well. Do you want me to stay on this slide, child victims of trafficking, or would you like the next slide?
If we could have the next slide, please.
Okay.
Right, just a couple of issues around child victims of trafficking. The Scottish Government fund a Scottish guardianship service for child victims of trafficking. At the moment, that is Aberlour that provide that service, and that is to take the child through the process and to support them while they're being considered as a potential victim of human trafficking. The legislation itself has a very specific section in it over the presumption of age. Aging a child victim of trafficking can be very, very difficult for us. Sometimes children will come from all over the world, and as many of you know, it's very difficult to know whether that person is a child. There are some nationality groups in particular who use scripts which advise their exploited persons to state to the police that they're children if they're caught, because rather than perhaps being considered as an adult through the criminal justice system, they will be considered as a child. Age assessment, we will proceed on the basis that that person is a child unless they are obviously not under 18, but it is up to social work to carry out the child age assessment on that, and that is if they so wish. It's not a mandatory requirement to do that. If I can have a new slide, please. It feels a bit like the coronavirus briefing, doesn't it? Right, why get involved in traffickers? Child exploitation, I think we can all agree, it can be pretty awful. Okay, so there are some very, very powerful push-pull factors for children. So escaping poverty is the main one that we find for children coming from other areas in the world to Scotland. We find most of the migrants start off as economic migrants. They want to come here as fleeing for a better life. They're clandestine entry by small boat. They come across here in the back of lorries, to the UK, and then are distributed up to Scotland. What they don't expect when they get here, perhaps, is then to be exploited. That's the legal part. So we're getting the war disaster and abuse sort of category. We're seeing a lot more people from war-torn and conflict areas such as Sudan, Iraq, Iran, Eritrea. A lot more children from these areas as well. There's a load of easy money. Now that one tends to be more for children recruited within the UK. They find a friend, they're befriended, and they're then provided with things to maybe to entice them to deal drugs and things like that. Families just want a better life for their children. That's why Vietnamese families in particular send their children to the UK to earn money. For family and friends already in the UK, we find that has been a push-pull factor mainly for the Pakistani diaspora within Scotland. They already have a base here, so coming here for a better life, and they already have family and friends here. There are established trafficking groups within the UK. We are aware that it's serious and organised crime groups that are bringing children to the UK or using children within the UK. They're very well funded. They have well established methods of bringing children into criminality. And we find debt bondage for travel to the UK. So they may want to come here for a better life, but they can't afford the travel. Therefore, they agree to work off their debt when they get to the UK. Unfortunately, that is a form of trafficking, and it's just that we can't allow that. So how are child victims recruited? Promise of a better life education. We have an ongoing case at the moment where young persons are being trafficked from another an African country to the UK on the promise of an education, and they find that they may have may be required to carry out domestic duties when they get here rather than further their education. Unfortunately, I can't speak about that one more as a live case, but it is happening out there. There's a cultural expectation, particularly perhaps amongst the Vietnamese diaspora, that children are expected to travel out with their country to make money to send back home. The held prisoner, physical by fear, drug dependency. You can read yourself what the push-pull factors are there. Absolutely, when it comes to children, scared to complain, they want to please their guardian or adult or grown-up figure. That is very much a push-pull figure. Fear of family finding out. We have a couple of young people that I'm aware of in the NRM at the moment who have fled the country because of their sexual orientation, and that they've come to the UK for a better life, and it is for fear of the family finding out about their sexual orientation. Sold by family and friends. We've already looked at an example of that with the stepfather. Abducted. I'm aware of a case where a father's abducted a child from another country, brought them to this country and then abandoned them within Scotland, within Edinburgh in fact, with the hope that she would have a better life here. So the lure of easy money, this is how we get most young people in Scotland into the drug dealing. We have found when we interview or speak to young persons that they actually quite enjoy the lifestyle that drug dealing can bring them. They have new trainers, telephones, money. That doesn't mean to say that they can agree to be exploited in that way. We also have the lover boy model. Children are groomed. Also adult females, this is the most common way of getting them into the UK for prostitution, is to think that they're in a relationship with their exploiter and they are in fact being groomed for prostitution. Can I have the next slide please? So general indicators when you're out and about, what is it that you see that would spark a suggestion that somebody may well be trafficked? You've got migrants with a lack of identity documents. You've got no parent or guardian within the UK, but somebody is usually looking after the child. They accidentally come across them perhaps. Unofficial interpreting, someone will speak for the child, or the child expresses fear and anxiety. The big one for us is that they're involved in criminality such as cannabis farming and drug supply. They don't usually think themselves, I know I'm going to set up a cannabis farm this morning, so somebody is behind that, and that's where the criminality lies. Can be very distrustful of the authorities. They're out with parental or guardians' control. We find that a lot with, or we have seen it with children that are accommodated particularly. They start to lose trust in the people that they're with. They start to move away from them, and they start to trust their exploiter more than the people who are looking after them. So if you see unexplained money or luxury items of clothing, this is something that's very well taught in the sexual exploitation side of things. That should be ringing alarm bells. Repeated offending is somebody then driving the young person back into criminality. Injuries and being secretive. These are well-known kind of indicators. So initial response, you as a first responder, if you think that a child has been trafficked, you must take a victim-focused approach. What are their needs? What are the requirements? Are they involved in criminality? But remember, medical assistance takes primacy in all of this, and that's a strong message that we get out to our officers. Contact the police, even if you just want to talk to us about what it is that you have found, the circumstances. We can help you with that. We can help you sort of work through what it is that you're actually looking for. We will then ask for further details. Consider if the child is safe. And if you find a child whose language is not, or first language is not English, consider an official interpreter. Don't let others interpret for that child, and that includes parents and guardians. Please consider early reporting of concerns. The earlier that we find out about these things, the more safeguarding, or the quicker we can get safeguarding measures in place. please use our 101 or 999 system. But there are also other ways of contacting us to let us know about criminality. We put these out to the general public, particularly where they want to remain anonymous. So we have the Modern Slavery Helpline, who have trained operators who are able to tease out the information that we need from people. We have the Unseen app, which will be getting rolled out to most police officers very shortly on their PDAs. And we have the Crime Stoppers number, which guarantees anonymity. So there are our contact details. The Scottish National Human Trafficking Unit, it doesn't roll off the tongue, does it? That email address. If you need to get in contact with us, please phone 101, just ask for us. Rather than having to remember all that, they will get in contact with us and we will speak to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. That was really, really interesting. I certainly learned a lot from that. We've already got a question coming up in the chat box for you. I wondered if you could answer. Forrest, it's quite a long question that you've put in there. So Forrest, if you wouldn't mind coming off of mute and just explaining your question again to Jacqueline, and then maybe she can answer for us.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Hi, Jacqueline. My question relates to, in the last couple of weeks, 4 young people have come to light in my work who are involved in trafficking to the degree that they're being used by drugs dealers to run drugs, and mysterious amounts of money have started appearing and some charges accruing. And my worry is that in some cases, and this is even amongst fellow professionals, there's a sense that these offences are being made through some sort of informed choice. But we know that children can be exploited, and particularly those who have been exposed to adverse childhood experience and are in amongst our care living population. And the focus is, the headline events grab all the attention here, but I'm just worried how much emphasis we're going to put on, because I would imagine there's thousands of young people being involved in trafficking at a lower level or at that kind of level, and will continue to be so. I mean, child trafficking has been here since the beginning of civilization. How much emphasis will be put on this? Because I think it's quite important that we recognise it. Children under 18 are identified as children and don't progress to adult courts and criminality. And would it help if there was a more cohesive approach in recognising and that this is trafficking being used at an earlier stage?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the main areas that we're working on at the moment. We fully appreciate that. A lot of my colleagues, when they get somebody who is dealing drugs, it's a great body. They've got somebody locked up. It's a slam dunk. They've committed the offence. What we do is we're getting that message out through our Human Trafficking Champion Network in Police Scotland, that they must start to have a wee look at that in more depth. You look at the next level up, it's who's exploiting that child. But just to put it in a wee bit of proportion, remember what I was saying about the European Convention of Human Rights Act ruling that took place last month. We've had a wee look at the numbers. There's actually, last year there was a 31% reduction in the number of children entering the NRM who describe criminality. So last year the number of children that were found in criminality, and remember they don't have any choice of being entered into the NRM, so I don't suspect that there's underreporting on that. In fact, yeah, there was a 31% reduction in the number of children entering the NRM and a 43% reduction in the number who described being made to commit criminal acts or being found in criminality. So I think we are a lot better at recognising it within Police Scotland, but last year we didn't put more through the criminal justice system, and this is something that we're speaking to Crown Office about. I think we're better at recognising that children may well be victims of trafficking. It is a message that we're pushing out there, and it is a message that we're going to continue to push out there, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and it makes, I mean, what you said earlier makes complete sense. It's really hard to identify these young people until they get caught, so to speak, because they're enjoying the lifestyle and the benefits, and most young people don't believe or understand how they're being manipulated and used by adults, and that's part of the problem. They're not coming to saying that this is an issue, and we have to identify it for them, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And we push that message out to our enforcement colleagues. You can't agree to be, or a child cannot agree to be used in this manner. Whether they agree or not, you just can't agree. That's part of the legislation.
Thanks very much, Jacqueline.
Thank you, Forrest. If you can pop yourself back on mute, we've got another question coming in for Jacqueline from Lauren Foster. Lauren, if you want to take yourself off of mute to ask Jacqueline the question.
Hiya, thanks for your presentation, Jacqueline. I just wanted to clarify something that you spoke about, the case of the 17-year-old who'd taken a 16-year-old friend along, where the 17-year-old was going to get drugs sort of in return for the 16-year-old being sexually exploited. Can I clarify that was UK residents, not people from out with Scotland? Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It was child sex offences that were libelled in that case against the males who had taken advantage of the child. What we did highlight was, though, that this piece of legislation could have been used or was considered against the 17-year-old who took her friend to that party, but she was considered to be a child at that time as well.
Yeah.
And she had been used by the exploiters who wanted to recruit a child into sexual exploitation.
Thank you, that's helpful. Thank you for clarifying that.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Have we got any other questions for Jacqueline before we move on to our next speaker? If you do, feel free to either put your hand up or put something in the chat box so I know to come to you. Okay, we've got 2 hands up, so let me have a quick look at who these are. So if we could start with Brett Morrison, if you could come off of mute and ask your question.
Hi Jacqueline, thanks for that presentation. I thought it was really helpful. I'm a team leader in one of Aberdeen City Council's children's homes, and you may be aware now that we can have young people living with us up until the age of 21. Okay, thus far it's not really happened, but I'd be a bit worried that we're inadvertently creating situations where our older group could be seen as trafficking younger people for crime. For example, if a 19-year-old took a 16-year-old out to get drugs or something, there could be a genuine friendship there, and neither the older person nor the younger person would see it in this context that we're talking about. Would there be certain provisions around that understanding that young people in our care, even if they're 18, 19, would still be very vulnerable in themselves, and that would be a trauma-informed approach that we're talking about across the country? I hope that question makes sense, Jacqueline.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. We can only work within the framework of the legislation that we're given. However, when we have somebody that we suspect of having committed a criminal offence involved in trafficking, we put the full circumstances of that to the Procurator Fiscal. So where we think that somebody has vulnerabilities that has led them into that offending, that would get explained to the Procurator Fiscal within the SPR2 or report to the Fiscal. I should also mention that where somebody is a victim of trafficking and they've committed an offence, because they're a victim of trafficking, it is up to the Fiscal to decide whether or not to prosecute. We will put the full circumstances. I think this is a misconception that a potential victim of trafficking won't be reported for an offence that they've committed. They absolutely will be reported, but then it is up to the Fiscal to decide whether it is in the public interest to prosecute that individual, and that's the Lord Advocate's guidelines that have been drawn up to work alongside the Act. I hope that kind of makes sense.
It does, thank you.
Thank you for that question, Brett. Have we got any other questions for Jacqueline? Brett, if you can pop your hand out. Oh, you've done it, you beat me to it. Pop your hand down. I think we had one from another person, but they seem to have put their hand down, so maybe Brett had that question answered. Are there any other hands up? We've got one from Amanda Smith. If you want to come off of mute and ask your question.
Hi, Jacqueline. I am from Includum, third sector organisation. And I'm just wondering about any areas that you're aware of, any work that's been undertaken currently in relation to how, or advice, I suppose, in terms of how we're talking about this with young people. I've been involved just very recently, I'm just back actually at work from maternity leave, and been involved in kind of looking at this in Aberdeen. And we were discussing, and actually Forrest, who asked the question, was questioning this as well, around the language and trafficking and young people not agreeing and understanding what that means and not identifying that for themselves. So just in terms of any areas of work or any advice in relation to discussing it with young people and really supporting their understanding in a way that's not so confrontational for them, that they kind of back away from those discussions. Thank you.
I know, I think, thanks Amanda, I think, see when you say human trafficking and modern slavery, it's just, they're really big scary phrases, and most people associate them with the slave ships of the 1700s. They don't associate it with activities that are going on nowadays. And I think a big driver for young people is to please their exploiter. So it's very, very difficult to have that conversation with them, particularly as the way that the Act is set up, there's a benefit for exploiters to use young persons in criminality, and then that the young person's desire to please the exploiter, it's a very, very difficult area to, it's a difficult cycle to break. That's where we have to get into sort of the intervention side of it, and to make not being trafficked and exploited far more attractive than engaging in these criminal behaviours. So the short answer is, it's a difficult one, Amanda. It's not one that police are, from our point of view, tackling. It's our Action Area 1 partners in the human trafficking strategy that tend to have a lot more answers in that side of it. If you think there's something I could take to Action Area 1 to develop, I can certainly do that at the next meeting, and we can see if we could maybe look at some kind of pack that would assist people who are looking after accommodated and young people.
Yeah, potentially, absolutely. And I think it's, it's like everything, there's guidance and all of these things, which is so important. But I think if we're talking about really genuine multi-agency approach, consistency in terms of language and messages, etc., is incredibly important. So having something that would be and I know that there is guidance, in terms of the actual process, but just that bit about how we are engaging those conversations and having that consistency across, because we're all working across a multitude of different settings, but equally working together to support our young people the best we can. So yeah, that's potentially something to think a wee bit more about.
Yeah,
I know. Thank you very much, Jacqueline.
I think the police are not particularly good at getting that "don't do this" message out to young persons. I think that's been an age-old problem, so we have to look to our partners and third sector sort of partners to assist us with that.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Okay, I'm very conscious of time, so we'll make this question that's just come in the last one. Claire, if you just want to come off of mute and ask your question, just so that everyone can hear it in case people don't have access to the chat box. So we've got Claire Reith asking a question, and then we'll move on to our next speaker.
Hi, thank you. Really interested in this morning's talk. Jacqueline, just wondering, I represent kind of the younger age, but I'm very familiar with kind of some of the work that the Children and Young People's Commissioner has done before. And I'm wondering whether that's been an approach that police could use to kind of gain some awareness or kind of how the language is used with children.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We look at all the outcomes of this. So yeah, it is an area that we consider. It's an area in our child criminal justice kind of side of things that we do look at. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both, and thank you so much again to our speaker, Jacqueline from Police Scotland. If I could ask everyone now to put their cameras off again and turn any mics that might still be on mute. And then can I please invite our next speaker, Kirsty Allen from Searchlight Scotland, to start her presentation.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm just checking everybody can hear me.
Yep, loud and clear.
Yeah, excellent, brilliant. Okay, so it's a privilege just to be here this morning and just to chat and talk about, you know, better outcomes for trafficked children. I've had the last 10 years have been dedicated to working with survivors of victims of human trafficking and families and children as well. And one of those operations included the child trafficking incidents that happened in Rotherham when there was quite a high number of incidents that were happening in an area. Currently, I'm the development director for Searchlight Scotland, which is based in Aberdeen, and I am also a consultant for Survivors of Human Trafficking in Scotland, SOTUS, where we support individuals to enter into the NRM to identify and also provide long-term support. So the key points that I will raise this morning are to chat about trafficked children situations, how they come into being, the situations happen in the UK, the impact of child trafficking, points of identification, types of trafficking abuse, and indicators and areas to consider and looking at our positive outcomes. So there are three different types of situations that are trafficked that can happen to a trafficked child. So they can be accompanied children, unaccompanied children, and internal trafficking as well. So accompanied children can arrive in the UK with an adult and their family or somebody else that has brought them over here, but they will be accompanied by an adult. And an unaccompanied children will arrive in the UK on their own and no family present. And internal trafficking is the movement of children from the UK and around the UK. And it does, just as Jackie just mentioned just now, it doesn't have to be moving, and they can be trafficked in their own authority as well. In 2019, just to give you a picture of the UK, in 2019, there was 10,627 victims referred into the NRM, the National Referral Mechanism, which Jackie just explained to us. Out of that 2019, 4,550 victims were under the age of 18. So that shows you how much in comparison the number recorded was children. If we can have a look at the nationalities that children are trafficked in, so this is the UK data. So the British children, 66.7% of those were from Britain. 11.5% were Vietnamese, 7.7% were Eritrean, 7.7% were Albanian, and 6.4% were Sudanese. And the gender of the children that are being trafficked, 76% of them are male and 24% are female. If we look at the NRM data in the UK, so 4,203 victims were identified in England, and that's in the child trafficking data. 174 were from Wales, 156 were from Scotland, and 16 were from Northern Ireland, and that is from the 2019 statistics. So there is a huge impact, as you can imagine, on children when they've been trafficked. When we look at, I've just put a few points on here that trafficking can impact on children. So we look at the first one, deprived rights. Survivors may have had their rights stripped away from them for so long, and it is so important that children are aware of their rights and are seen and heard. Self-worth, when a child is in a particular traffic situation, I will go on to speak about 3 different case studies later on. And you will see how children's self-worth had been stripped away in those situations. You know, I'll never forget a story about a guy, a little boy called Sam, whose family I worked with, and he had been trafficked with his mum. His mum was trafficked for sex and held in a house for up to 7 years. And him and his little brother had lived in a locked room for 7 years. And I'll never forget every time when he was in a safe house after he'd been identified and brought to a safe house within the NRM, I'll never forget how him and his mum had no value of self-worth. Every time you gave them a gift, he would cry and say he didn't deserve it. And that was, you know, because everything had been stripped away from him. Education, you know, Sam, just as I'll speak about later on, was stripped of education, and their education is missing. And as we speak about the county lines as well, children are missing school. Children are missing education. Some children are being brought across from other countries and missing that really important part of their childhood in education. The creation of false identity, you know, is practitioners here primarily working with children. We know how important the identity of a child is. And because false identities, false names are given to children due to identification issues or to hide from the crimes, this can cause trauma in the child's life. You know, it's so important for the child to know who they are, to know their name, and have that value of sense and self-esteem and self-worth. You know, living a life that's not theirs can cause serious impacts on through adolescence and into adulthood as well. You know, children are seriously undermined, which when they are trafficked, and this can cause constant criticism and direction and abuse, and leads them to have no self-confidence and leaving them powerless. The loss of family, you know, some children are brought across and left, just as Jackie had explained, you know, a child being sold. That loss is so damaging. You know, us as adults can struggle with it, and especially children, and that grief that they carry, and being separated for families. I'll chat about that in the case studies later as well. That can bring a feeling of loss, again, loss of identity. You know, that has an effect and an impact on what trafficking can bring to a child's life as well. And implied criminality, you know, being at the age of 16 and being classed as a criminal can be so disruptive in a child's life and hinder them from walking forward. It can also lead to individuals missing out on people's lives and education and future of sense of security and jobs, and accessing university and PVG checks, etc. can be hindered. So just a few points of identification. Often identifying trafficking, identifying child trafficking can be difficult because there are unseen things, you know, unseen vulnerabilities. So they may not show signs of vulnerabilities. They may be taught to behave in certain ways. They may not show signs of distress. So, for example, if they're taught that they need to carry drugs from one place to another, they may have had this behaviour innate within them. There may be no obvious signs of distress. You know, they may be comfortable in the environment because it's all they've had for a while. And due to the resilience and the high level trauma and the high level of resilience, they may find it hard to create trust, find it hard to discuss certain things, and they may actually even have threats over them as well. That they're not allowed to say certain things or describe certain things. Imminent harm, there may be at high risk or may have already been harmed. You know, threats can come into their life. Children may be being physically abused. Their threats might be on their family as well if they don't do a particular task or don't do what they are being told to do in the trafficking situation. They may be vulnerable to particular types of abuse. So, for example, criminality, sexual neglect, and I'll chat about that in the next slide as well. And future patterns. So due to the involvement in trafficking, this could exist in the future. So have they been involved in this before? Has their family been involved in this before? Is this going to be the future pattern of what they're going through? So the effects of trafficking abuse on children. So we've got the 5 categories of abuse that we're so used to seeing here. And when we look at in terms of trafficked children, we can see more pointers here. So, for example, physical abuse. The child may experience beatings. They may be being subdued with drugs, on which they can become more dependent on. Alcohol addiction, PTSD, stress disorders, skin diseases due to stress. You know, I've seen a lot of children suffering from bad skin diseases due to the trauma that they've suffered. Migraine and backaches due to maybe the work that they've been forced to do. Psychological abuse, so they may be worried constantly and may feel like criminals, low self-esteem, psychological distress, flashbacks, nightmares, disassociation, antisocial behaviour and fear of authorities. And sexual abuse, so there may be control, the trauma, pregnancy, STIs, HIV, AIDS, and sexualised behaviour. And emotional abuse. They may feel disorientated after leaving family and their new identity, isolation, and they may lose trust in adults, and neglect. So there may be medical attention, education, and welfare that is neglected. So I'm just going to chat to you, talk you through 3 journeys of 3 different people this morning, from Samuel, Jenny, and Leo. So Samuel was brought over to the UK with his family. They flew over with their family from Iran, and Samuel's mum and dad was involved in labour trafficking, and then Samuel was put into foster care when they were identified and unable to look after Samuel. So Samuel had a great time in foster care until the age of 18, where he was found out to be an illegal immigrant because there had been no asylum process that had started for him during his time in care. And at that point, he wanted to apply for university, but couldn't because he didn't have the right type of visa, didn't have the right type of leave to remain. So Samuel fled his foster placement and ended up being trafficked, ended up going back into forced labour and being trafficked, being involved in the drug trafficking ring as well. And he spent the next 5 years working for little pay work, being involved in drugs, getting into addiction. And then after 5 years, he was identified as a victim. And then finally, at the age of 23, went through the process of the asylum process and managed to find his way back into education, managed to settle into the UK because it was unsafe for him to return. You know, Samuel is quite a sad case because there's so much of his life got missed in the system, and it started off with him being trafficked as a child and then ended up as an adult being trafficked as well. However, just a bit of a good news story on that. Samuel is now actually in university and studying, so that situation has turned around for him. Jenny is another individual. When she was 12, she is from the UK, and she was groomed by a 60-year-old man, and Jenny was lavished with gifts, designer things, phones, you name it, that was given to her by the 60-year-old man. She just thought that he was her friend. And then as the years went by, he started introducing her to more men, and then ended up her being trafficked all over the UK, all over to different cities. And at one point, she was actually trafficked internationally for sex. So she was bought and sold for sex all across the country. You know, when she went to some of the authorities, they seen it as her behaviour, her risky behaviour. And this went uncovered for quite some time. Until the age of 21, she was referred into the National Referral Mechanism. But from the age of 12, she was showing signs and indicators that she was actually being trafficked. You know, she's doing well now. She's got herself into education. She's got herself an amazing job, but she's still living with the effects of trauma. She's still living with the injuries that was provided to her, that was given to her by the traffickers as she was a child. And the last child that I'll talk about this morning is Leo. And Leo came to the UK with his family when he was just a young boy. His dad was promised a good job, and when they arrived, him and his 9 brothers and sisters from Romania, they lived in a small 1-bedroom flat. And his dad was forced to work day and night in a car wash, with the bosses coming in to check on the apartment. And when they came in, they physically abused his dad, his mum, and the children. They were violent towards them, and they received little food, and all social benefits that was given to that family when they applied for benefits was taken from the family and given to the bosses that was controlling that situation, the traffickers. And again, that's benefit fraud. You know, Leo was then forced to do drug running, so county lines across Scotland and England, and was forced to steal. His sisters were forced to sleep with men for money as well, and Leo's family were identified through a car wash operation that happened in Yorkshire, and they were provided safe accommodation, and then they were repatriated back to Romania. But that few years of Leo's life was so disruptive. I'm not quite sure where Leo is now, but I really hope that, you know, he's been given the support in order to get his life back on track, but that trauma will have affected him in some way or shape or form. So for us as professionals this morning, areas to to consider for positive outcomes. Every child that we work with, every young person that we work with, we need to work hard to build up that trust. However, working with victims of trauma and trafficking, that trust needs to be built on so much more. You know, there will be times where they won't speak, they will be reluctant to say anything, they will be told to say X, Y, and Z, and that trust needs to be built up. It may take a long time as well. You know, a place of safety, are they in safe accommodation? Are they feeling safe in the office that you are even speaking to them? Have they got a nice place to sit? Have they got magazines? Have they got something that they can look at while they are waiting? Do they feel safe in that moment? Interviewing the child separately if they are brought in with a group of young people, it is so important that you get that direct story from the individual themselves. And discretion, you know, children can hear things going on all the time, we know that. But especially if we are talking to someone in a different language, make sure that everything's being translated and make sure that you are discreet about certain things and working within the confidentiality agreements put in place. You know, as we've seen from Samuel's story, legal advice to a child is so important in the criminal sense and the immigration sense. So as soon as possible, it is important that that child gets legal advice ASAP. Make sure that we have an awareness of and understanding of the situations, and as well as the child is always provided with awareness and understanding of the situation. Make sure that we are completing risk assessments, and as Jackie says, how important age assessments are. And outcomes required for trafficked children. You know, we always need to make sure that the health and well-being of the child is paramount, and that we're following local authority protocols and guidance. We have an awareness and we're providing training so that everybody is aware of the NRM and the referrals are being created to the NRM. Make sure that if a child is called to be a witness in the crime or in the human trafficking case, that that support is provided to the child, that that child is supported through the witness process, and that that child is provided therapeutic support, so for example, counselling or a therapeutic community. Make sure that as individuals in our practice that we are working from a trauma-informed point of view, that we are developing our learning, but also creating that trauma-informed practice. You know, it's so important that all agencies work together. We hear this probably every single day, and it is, again, when we've seen this event happening, you know, there's so much different professionals sitting around the table, and it's important that we're working together for the benefit of the child. You know, it's always important that our workforces and our professionals that we're working with and first responders, that we are accessing training, that we are knowing how to spot the signs and how to look out for individuals and how to actually refer into the NRM and refer into the correct services. It's been great to chat this morning. If you want to get in touch and find out any more about our services, my details are on here, and the organisations that I work for are on there as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Kirsty. That was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed hearing about the 3 case studies as well with Samuel, Jenny and Leo. They were really, really insightful. Thank you. Has anyone got any questions for Kirsty? Then before we move on to our next speaker from Police Scotland, we have Leslie Clark. Has anyone got any questions? Hands up, or maybe leave something in the chat comments so that I can refer back to Kirsty. It looks like we do have a hand up. Who's this from? We have a hand up from Catherine Lorimer. If you want to come off of mute so you can ask Kirsty that question, that'd be great.
Yeah, I was just, obviously at the end you were saying about the sort of multi-agency approach to responding to young people who are being trafficked. And I'm just wondering, it's probably something that Forrest touched on because he obviously spoke about a young person, and that's actually a young person that we're working with together. But I think it's probably as a multi-agency approach, how do we all understand the NRM and, you know, what sort of training will be delivered? Because obviously there's guidance and we can discuss all that, but how will that look in a sense of, and that's probably not essentially just for you, Kirsty, but how do we actually make sure that everybody's understanding the process for the NRM and who takes leadership for that, and, you know, moving forward so that the young people aren't being missed at the age of, you know, 12 and not getting picked up until they're 21.
Yeah. Jackie, I see your hand up. Did you want to jump in there just now?
Yeah, sorry, that's a very fortuitous question. Funnily enough, there is a training package being released tomorrow for first responders in the NRM from Action Area 1 that I mentioned earlier on of the Scottish Government's human trafficking strategy. So that document will be available, and there will be publicity tomorrow regarding its launch.
Yeah, so just as Jackie said, the toolkit is got to be coming into play, and it has been developed by the Action Area group, and it is a brilliant piece that people can access. But if you want to find out more as well, just get in touch, because and I know that Hannah can provide details on training as well. But yeah, it is important that we all are aware of what even do we put in, but the toolkit is got to be what's coming out tomorrow, and the training launch has got to be excellent for practitioners.
Yeah, I suppose just to sorry, Catherine, just to butt in there as well. In the next presentation we'll see from Leslie Clark, we do actually learn a little bit more now about NRM, I suppose, training insofar as like the city frontline workers, what to do with that, and also on the training slides I'll talk over after Leslie's spoken. That'll explain a little bit more about where multi-agency practitioners in Aberdeen City can go to learn more about NRM and when it should be used and who's in charge of that. Okay, if there are no other questions for Kirsty, Catherine, if you can pop your hand down if that's you done with questions. If it's not, feel free to keep your hand up and I'll come back to you. What I'll do now is I'll stop sharing the slides for Kirsty. Thank you again so much for that, Kirsty. That was very, very interesting. And I will pass over to Leslie Clark from Police Scotland.
Morning, folks. Like Sheena's introduced me already at the start, I'm Leslie Clark. I'm one of the detective inspectors within the Public Protection Unit based in Bucksburn in Aberdeen. Again, as Sheena's already mentioned, I co-chair one of the working thematic groups with Annabelle Turner from CyberSafe Scotland, and that's to do with CSE, child sexual exploitation, child trafficking and online safety. So today I'm going to make reference to the guidance document that's been launched, to tell you a bit of kind of how that came about, and speak about, like I say, what's contained within the document. So if Hannah, could you just bring up my IT skills are non-existent, so Hannah's kindly agreed to share it. I don't know if you've all had the chance to look at it. Obviously, you know, after today you can in your own time go away and look at it. I think it's important to mention here, I can't remember, Amanda, if it was yourself that spoke about it, but you know, guidance is guidance, that's it. You know, we'll go on to, I'll go on to speak afterwards once I've referenced it as to what we can look at moving forward multi-agency. But certainly the child trafficking guidance came into play on the back of really a few inquiries that we had within Aberdeen City, and it became quite apparent that some practitioners, and you know, including police, absolutely were struggling to, one, identify the indicators, identify that the age groups, the 16-17-year-old bracket group in particular, we do class as a child, therefore, you know, we safeguard them and put the safety measures in place as we would do a child under 16. And basically ensure, you know, what we do collectively, what information we share to make those informed decisions around that child, what we thereafter do, you know, moving forward. So I don't intend to run right through the guidance document. However, I'll just make reference to it, and Hannah can just scroll down as I do so. So on the screen just now, we came up with the child trafficking and exploitation flowchart, which is just a kind of shorter, more concise guide about what we do. So when we're faced with, you know, whatever time of day or night, we've got a concern that a child or young person is being trafficked, what do we do? So that's a pretty short guide, as in, you know, where we go, what checks we do. It makes reference to the NRM, which we've already spoken about. Both Kirsty and Jackie have made reference to that, and then what we do thereafter. obviously the IRD, the interagency discussion forming a kind of crucial part in that, because like I say, Jackie had mentioned before, that's when the information would be shared and the decision round about the NRM would be made. So if we just move on, Hannah, through the guidance, like I say, I'm not going to go in any great detail in the guidance. You can all look at it in your own time. And again, just to reiterate, it is just guidance. You know, it's just to give practitioners an idea about what child trafficking is. We've already spoken about that. Maybe it's important to say just now, I think Forrest made a very good point there. Child trafficking, it's quite, you know, to make a statement saying a child's been trafficked. We do still think, and you know, I've been guilty of it absolutely with investigations and concerns that have come to light, that we still think of child trafficking as being very much children and young persons that are coming into the country. We know that in Aberdeen City we've had you know, the Eastern European young persons that have been involved in the sex industry. We know we've had them, we've had those inquiries. We know we've had the Vietnamese children and young persons that are still part of our care experience system. I think it's important to say, and again, Forrest and some of the other practitioners were saying themselves, child trafficking is exploitation. It's exploitation that happens on the doorstep. You know, child trafficking is recruitment and it is the movement. However, movement can be within a house, you know, movement can be within one domestic property. It doesn't have to be, you know, coming from within, you know, from foreign countries. It doesn't have to be the county line type activities where we're getting children and young persons obviously trafficked and moved across cities, etc., for the movement of drugs. It can be, you know, Tilly Joe and Seaton, your 15-year-old go to pick up a, you know, drugs order for the guy that lives in the next high rise. So I think, again, we've touched on it in the questions we've asked. It's very much that, you know, indicators, being aware of that it's not just this kind of child trafficking idea that we have. You know, it's kind of the children that we're already working with, you know, the children that are local to us, and having that awareness of, you know, what indicators there are. So going through the guidance, like I say, we've spoken a bit about what child trafficking is. There's a bit there about the research context, which Jackie and Kirsty went into in quite a lot of detail just in relation to the data and stats that we have just now. Then there's indicators there. It's not exhaustive at all. You know, it kind of breaks it down. We've tried to break it down just into the different physical appearance, restricted movements. But like I say, there's so many indicators there, again, for children that you're working with. Again, Jackie spoke about the 16 and 17-year-old. I think, Forrest, it was yourself that touched on the care experience, you know, a very, very vulnerable group, and probably one that's at the highest risk of exploitation, whether that's child criminal exploitation or your sexual exploitation. And it's looking out for those indicators, you know, we've had quite a few. This is out with the city, but we've had quite a few up north, and it's these party houses. Knowing that you know, your 16, 17-year-olds, 14, 15-year-olds are away to these parties every weekend. You know, who are they going with, and why are they going? You know, are they coming back with other devices, etc. So many different indicators that I think we probably need to get better at identifying. And so just moving on, the responses, again, not exhaustive at all. How to kind of, it's just touching on there, how to speak to a child. Now that's how to speak to a child. Again, Jackie touched on it. If it's a child that's come from abroad or from another area, you know, that we need an interpreter, how to speak to them out with the presence of the parent carer who may well be their trafficker, but also as well, you know, how to speak to children within your own care establishments or children perhaps that you're working with. Again, I can't remember if it was the Includum that we said that, you know, the indicators are there, and some practitioners are recognising that there's concerns for children. It's how to speak to them. You know, is it better to speak to them at your care establishment? Is it better to speak to them at school? Just taking all these things into consideration. Moving on from that, again, both Jackie and Kirsty touched on the age assessments and the presumption of age, which is absolutely, you know, we do go with. Obviously, the paediatricians are well versed on age assessments and, you know, how to go about them. So just a bit of information on that. And then moving on to the NRM. Somebody did earlier make a very valid point. We speak about the NRM as if everybody knows what it is, but there's probably a lot of people in this audience that don't, you know, that knows it's a referral mechanism, but how does it work? How do I access it? If I'm a first responder, which we all are, sitting here, if I'm a first responder, how do I know when to enter somebody into the NRM? Then we've spoken about, obviously, a child cannot consent. So if we suspect a child to be a potential victim of trafficking, then, you know, we're duty bound to get that child into the process. Hannah's obviously touched on that. If anybody is wanting more information, then we can go to Hannah just as the learning and development team, and we can get more information there. It does have a link there to the new online process, which is really good. If you've not used it, it is it's really easy to use. It's got a really good like tick list as well that you can actually print off and take with you to ask those questions. So it's a really good process since they've developed the online one. We spoke a bit about legalities, and again, this would be children more for coming into the country around about the independent guardianship. And Kirsty said absolutely get legal representation as soon as possible for that child moving forward. And again, we've spoken about the legal advice. Again, that's there, and that's something, again, once we've identified, you know, a child may be victim, once we've put the measures in place that we needed to safeguard that child, then we look at the legal advice, etc., that child will need. So that's really just a very quick whirlwind run through of the guidance. I think today, you know, I sit on the, like I said, I co-chair the group. You know, I'm not an expert on child trafficking at all, and that's Jackie's remit. And if I have any queries involving, you know, potential victims of trafficking, I'll always go to Jackie's team for advice and obviously get the required direction, etc., from her. But I think it's just, and again, there's a few of you that have mentioned, it's something that we are definitely getting better at within Aberdeen City. And Grampian area across the Shire, etc., as well, at identifying it. You know, we speak about county lines. That is obviously the movement of children to move drugs and run drugs, etc. That was on the go when I joined the police in 2000. But we're now identifying it, and it's this sort of like shifting a mindset. I think somebody had mentioned it earlier as well. Shifting the mindset away from criminality. It's really difficult, and it's really difficult from the police perspective because, you know, the 3 15-year-olds, when the drugs intel came in, that there was a stash for a very well-known drug dealer. The 15-year-olds go and get it. The cops turn up. They get the 15-year-olds. Boof, that's fine. We've got a concern in possession and concern, supply case, great. But it's actually stopping and saying, well, wait a minute. The 15-year-olds didn't go and get the drugs for themselves. The 15-year-olds are being exploited. You know, they're doing that for somebody else's gain. So it's absolutely moving forward. How do we shift that mindset? How do we come together collaboratively to say, right, we've got concerns about this child. Like Jackie said, we will always report. You know, the criminal justice side of it as well are absolutely looking at, you know, the different aspects of that over in criminal justice, and that coincides with harmful behaviour, etc., etc. But how can we, I suppose, multi-agency moving forward? We've got this guidance. We're now saying we're starting to identify it better. What can we then do moving forward? And I think it's something that, again, somebody had mentioned there, that maybe moving forward, it is a case of, right, okay, so if we're identifying these within our care experience, if we're identifying these within schools, if health visitors are thinking, well, wait a minute, I've been working with this family now for some time and I've got concerns about the 15-year-old in the house, it's what do we do with that? And it's having that discussion, and I've had quite a few discussions just, you know, sitting from where I sit with different practitioners across the, you know, whether it be, again, in your kind of care experience side, you know, I've got these concerns, what do you think? And it's that information sharing, it's that discussion to say, well, okay, there's maybe not criminality there, but there's absolute concern. So, you know, what do we do with that? You know, moving forward, it's great having this forum to have these discussions and to bring people together to say, well, actually, you know what we need? I saw some of the comments there, not just the guidance, we need, you know, packs for, you know, carers, for foster carers, we need packs to go into schools, but it's now everybody's responsibility to take that forward. You know, I sit on the group under CPC, but you've all got to feed into that through your line managers, through your service managers, whoever it may be. So now it's a really good time, I think, to say, right, we're kind of starting to really get a feel for this. You know, the child criminal side of it, there's Bernardo's and Crime Stoppers are doing a launch at the end of the month to raise that awareness, and that's for, you know, practitioners, it's for carers, parents and children themselves. You know, it's things like that that we do need to be looking at. Do we need to change languages? Absolutely. But I think until, you know, you that are out there working with the children, that are seeing the children come through, it's really important to voice that and to get that into the kind of CPC and say, right, we've done this multi-agency, but now we need to do this, and just keep that momentum and keep it going, if that makes sense. So, like I say, I'm no expert by any means on child trafficking, but that was a bit of a run through as to how the guidance sort of came about, and hopefully where we're looking to go moving forward.
Thank you, Leslie. I thought that was really clear. I thought that was really, really well spoken through, and lots of comments coming through in the chat feature anyway, saying that they agree and that you've explained things very well. Someone there just saying well said. So yeah, I thought that was really, really well explained. Has anyone got any questions for Leslie before we move on, just to look at some of the training we currently have available to city practitioners? It looks like we've got one from Peter Henry. If you want to come off of mute, Peter.
Hi, Leslie. Leslie, my question just relates to kind of the county line stuff and kind of how increasingly we're seeing kids from other parts of the UK kind of pop up in our area. And I'm just wondering if there's anything you're aware of in terms of standards of best practice for when these kids come to our attention. Because I know we have dialogue with their home authorities, and we work really well with kind of Police Scotland to try and get them returned. But it just seems that kind of each time we're trying to kind of almost make a plan on the day to try and kind of figure out what we need to be doing with these kids. And I suppose secondly, I'm just wondering, is there anything kind of that as a multi-agency group we can do to try and kind of disrupt the movement of these kids to our area? And I know that's a massive question, but I suppose we have had some of the home authorities contact us and say kind of, you know, is there some particular draw in Aberdeen? You know, we've had contact from authorities in Merseyside and Yorkshire kind of saying, what is the draw in Aberdeen? So yeah, so I know it's quite a big question and not something that's kind of easily answered, but I suppose it's just something that has come up a number of times, and I just thought I'd kind of not necessarily put it to you as a question that I'm expecting an answer to, but just as an idea, I suppose, to put out there.
Yeah, no, thanks, Peter. Absolutely, valid points. Absolutely. County lines again. You know, I've kind of said it's not a new thing. It's been on the go for a long time. I don't know, I can't say whether there's an increase in the kind of like county lines aspect with the children and young persons coming into the northeast, or whether again it's just that we're identifying it better. You know, again, before, if you picked up 3 17-year-olds from Merseyside, West Mids, wherever it would be, they would be dealt with, the criminal side of it would be dealt with, and that would be it. Whereas now we're actually saying, right, wait a minute, why are these children here? How did they get here? So I suppose for the first part of your question, yeah, absolutely, it's a nightmare. It's not great the way I don't think it's great the way we deal with it. I was duty a few weeks ago and we had a 16 and 17-year-old up from Rotherham. Once we went round all the houses and actually identified, they didn't have drugs on them, but once we identified that there was concerns, they weren't looked after children. However, there was concerns from their home, where they'd come from, the social services down there. So it's like, right, what do we do with these children? We've had them at Kitty Brewster, obviously a custody suite. It's not ideal. We need to get them home. So there was a bit of a rigmarole, and we do a halfway hop with West Yorks and get them safely down the road. But like you say, Peter, it's not easy when that comes to light. Coincidentally, on the back of that, we've got a national county lines unit who are currently looking at what happens is when we identify children from other areas, there is a risk assessment done and it does get put down to that area. What we're in the process of doing is trying to identify, it's really difficult, but trying to identify the most frequently used areas for children coming up, and we are trying to put measures in place to say, right, when this child comes from Rotherham, this is who we contact. So it is easier, but there's no quick fix to it. I think, like I say, key in it all is that we're identifying it now. We're not just criminalising these kids, we're identifying it. And that goes for children within our own local areas as well. It's not just these children that are coming in from out with. I spoke about the 15-year-olds. That was again, a few weeks ago, that was a incident that happened. So yeah, again, in answer to your question, Peter, sorry, it is an issue. We're identifying it better, and there are some measures being put in place to try and make the kind of safeguarding round about that, with linking in obviously with their hometowns, to ensure again that sort of wrap around when they go home. Sorry, I've kind of gone on. I can't remember what was the other question you asked. I think in terms of the disruption of it, it would be too big a thing to talk about just now. Like I say, there's the county lines, it's a huge area of organised criminal gangs. And yeah, like you say, Peter, in an ideal world, what we need to do is disrupt the gangs down in Merseyside, West Mids, etc. And that would stop the problem. It is getting looked at more, the whole county lines thing. It is more awareness raising going into it. So again, moving forward, we're certainly going in the right direction. But again, absolutely no quick fix to the disruption of it. It's on a really big scale. So I hope that kind of answers some of your questions.
Yeah, that's
Thank
grand.
you, Leslie. Oh, sorry, Peter, I'm talking over you.
No, just I know that answers the question. Thank you. I know there was no kind of quick fix. I suppose it was just a kind of a pointer that I kind of wanted to raise. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Leslie. Just because I'm very conscious of time, we're going to move on now to actually my presentation on just some of the local training that is available to all staff in the city. So let me just pull that up, and then we will have time for questions and answers at the end. If you had any more questions for Leslie or any of our other speakers, then not to worry, we can come back to those in just a little while. This is just loading. Right, so this is just a flavour of some of the training that we currently have. What we actually do provide is, if you go to the Aberdeen Getting It Right website and you go to the Learning and Development page and you scroll down that page, you'll find an interactive calendar. And in that calendar, you'll find lots of different multi-agency training that's available, both on child protection training and GERFEC training. And one of the trainings that I provide is on child sexual exploitation and child trafficking. So what I've done is I've just pulled together a couple of slides that do exist in the much bigger presentation on CSE and trafficking, just focusing on trafficking today to give you a flavour of what that training covers should you want to attend any of our training going on this year. So I won't spend too much time on this one. All of our other speakers have already spoken about this, but we do, of course, in the training talk about kind of the three things that we say have to happen if we are to class something as being human trafficking. So we need an action, a means and a purpose. But of course, as Jacqueline's already said, the means is not required in the case of children or young people. They cannot consent. It's still considered to be trafficking. And we go on to discuss that in a lot more detail in our training. We also just recently added more information about county lines because, as Leslie was saying, it's been around for a very long time, but I feel like it's just getting a bit more recognition now. More agencies are becoming privy to it, want to support, want to help, are more like recognising that it's happening with the children they're supporting. reporting. So we have a whole section in there now on county lines, drug trafficking, how children are groomed into gangs, the kind of normal routes they would be expected to take with, you know, grams of whatever or multiple bags of drugs to be taken to other big cities, be that Glasgow, London, etc. We then do an activity. We have a little activity in our training where you learn about Harry and Connor. And what I do is I ask you to break out into little breakout rooms with maybe 5 or 6 multi-agency practitioners in each breakout room. And we cover this scenario of Harry meeting this boy Connor, who starts kind of, as you'll find as you read this, grooming Harry into doing a little bit of drug running for him. And after we read this, we go into our breakout rooms and we answer we answer the question, is what we've seen exploitation and is this trafficking? So we talk together after the activity's finished back in the main group about our concerns for Harry. Is it exploitation? Is it trafficking? And also, are we concerned for Connor? Because as we can see there, he's only 17, so should we not also be concerned for him? We then look at the impact that trafficking has on children. Again, this has already been covered, but we just like to highlight that this is, of course, always a very serious child protection issue because of the varied ways in which a child can be harmed through the child trafficking process. We then look at a few different acts and laws that I think are quite interesting to know about for any multi-agency practitioner currently working with a child or young person where you're concerned about exploitation or trafficking. One of those acts we look at is the non-punishment principle in law. And although I don't think that would necessarily help you as practitioners day to day, it's certainly something to add to your toolbox as a practitioner and certainly know more about as you work with children, especially if you're concerned about trafficking. Maybe drug lines is something, or sorry, county lines is something you're particularly concerned about, then hopefully that law that we go into is quite helpful to you. We also look at a case study that happened a few years ago. I'm sure when you come to the training and we start describing Michael, you'll probably know actually which young male we are describing who now lives in Aberdeen City. We go over his case, what happened during that case, and then we have time for questions and answers on kind of what are the challenges that we faced as a city when we dealt with Michael, what were our learnings, what could we have done better, what did we do well when we worked with Michael, and certainly what can we do better in future are all things that we cover in this training. We also then look at what happens if we do get a disclosure, bearing in mind that it's very rare that we'll ever get a disclosure for child trafficking because most children, especially depending on their age, are completely, as we've seen in the chat come up time and time again, they're completely unaware that they are being trafficked in the first place. They don't know that this is something that they should be concerned about. So really, when you do finally, I suppose, get an admission or someone finally accepts that actually what's happening is trafficking, then you have the what's going to happen to me. You know, I believe you. I believe that I'm now in trouble. What will happen to me now that I've kind of been safeguarded? So they'll have lots of concerns, especially depending on whether they're from a different country and they've been trafficked in. They'll be concerned about things like threats of being an illegal immigrant. They might have been groomed or gaslighted by their trafficker into believing that should they ever tell someone what's going on, they're straight back to their country and they'll suffer the consequences once they're back there. Any previous contact they've had with the police might have been negative, either in their own country or if they're born here and live here, they might just not have a very good relationship with the police. So that could be an issue. So although they might be very trusting of you as the practitioner that's been supporting them for a couple of months or a year or so, it doesn't mean that they're going to suddenly start immediately trusting every other practitioner that you now have to realistically bring into that child's life. And we talk about how we would deal with that. Other concerns around debt bonding, whether that's a child that's been born and raised in the UK or has been brought in from another country. Debt bonding could be something either way that they could be really, really concerned about. You know, they've stopped working now that they've been safeguarded potentially. And what does that mean for me? And what does that mean for my family? Depending on their set of circumstances, they could face reprisals from their own families. We then also kind of halfway through the training look at how child trafficking and child sexual exploitation are connected. We talk about the drama that was put on, I think in 2017, 2018, on what happened in Rotherham in the early noughties, and it's a drama we look at that was on BBC iPlayer in 2018 called Three Girls. And I'm sure out of the 100 people or so that are here today, at least a handful of you have already seen this drama. It was very, very well put together. I encourage everyone that comes on the training to go away and watch that programme, because it doesn't over dramatise what happened. You can see through the 3-part drama exactly how the children were groomed, how the trafficking began, how the sexual exploitation happened. Of course, it is a hard watch in places, but it's very, very worthwhile. And the whole way through, you are kind of left questioning really what came first, because you really can't decipher whether the grooming happened before the trafficking or whether the trafficking happened before the grooming and the exploitation. So it just kind of proves to us how seriously connected exploitation, be that sexual exploitation and trafficking, how strongly they're connected. We then look at the national referral mechanism. We talk about that in a lot of detail. We explain who a first responder is. We go through 5 stages of kind of from start to finish what filling in a national referral mechanism would start off for that child. So they get a legal advocate looking after their rights, especially if they weren't born in the UK. So it would trigger a stay period of 90 days, so they can't be removed from the UK, so that it can be investigated and they can be properly protected. So we look at that. I provide the link for filling in a national referral mechanism form online should you ever need the link to complete one yourself. We talk about who a first responder is, and then at the very end of the training I signpost people who complete this training on to complete a short e-module provided by the Home Office. It's an it's an England developed e-module, which is why it's called Modern Slavery, but once you click in you can actually choose which country you're working in, and then it will like tailor the training to meet what legislation and obviously laws and acts you'll be following as part of your country that you're working in. So there is a specific Scotland one you can follow. I did it myself. It took about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, and it's really, really good. And we've now got social work students in RGU completing this as like a compulsory part of their course, which is fantastic. So that's me done. I don't think there's any more slides from that. Like I said, it was a very short stop whistle tour on what is provided in our child sexual exploitation and child trafficking training. So I suppose what I'll do now is I know Stuart Lamberton wants to come back in and say a little bit more, and then I think what we'll do is after Stuart's spoken, we'll have time for questions both for myself on this training and all of our other speakers. So Stuart, if you want to come back in now, that's me done. I'll stop presenting.
Could you put the flyer back up on the screen, Hannah?
Yeah, will do.
Brilliant. Okay, before we quickly go to questions, because after questions, obviously everyone will be heading away. Just wanted to take the opportunity to thank all of our speakers for coming along and sharing their expertise. I know Leslie was very modest, saying she's not an expert, but the level of knowledge that colleagues like Leslie bring to the table is absolutely crucial to getting these things off the ground. We were slightly worried that it wasn't a live event. You'll see this is just a normal Teams meeting with like over 100 people in it, so we weren't sure how that was going to go because the technology gremlins in the system when we trialed the live event really didn't work. We had people on the opposite side of the meeting and all sorts of stuff was going wrong, so really pleased that it's went well. I just wanted to go back to a point that Peter Henry made around county lines and just kind of say where things are from a child protection perspective nationally and locally. So right now Highland are I'm led to believe, and I've seen it once, the Highland have produced a local guidance for their area because they're getting a lot of county lines issues, if you like, and that was recently put to the Scottish Government, who are now considering it. At the last meeting of Child Protection Committee Scotland, they've said that they're now going to look at putting out guidance for local areas as well. And I can tell you, Peter, that it's on the agenda for our local CPC who meet next week. So at the moment, there's nothing in terms of local guidance in place, what to do, how to address it, that type of thing. But as Leslie and Jacqueline and others have touched on, obviously things can grow arms and legs, so it's about how the CPC would want to approach it in terms of governance of that and what that would look like. I know that Highlands Guidance, who we're working hand in hand with at the moment, is like only a few pages long. It's more of like a briefing note, like an aid memoir, just to for staff and practitioners to have with them. So there'll certainly be steps made over the coming weeks to kind of push that forward on a local basis here in Aberdeen, and I'm sure that work will link up with Aberdeenshire and Murray. I also wanted to share that, and this was by no coincidence at all, when myself, Leslie, Annabelle, Thematic Group, Hannah kind of pulled the date together, that it's coincided with National CSE Awareness Day. I'm going to put some links in the chat after I've finished talking around some information on that, which is obviously very relevant for today's discussion. And if you Google any of that, I'm sure there'll be lots of information and support that come up. I also wanted to highlight that I hope now that you've seen the guidance that's been created, that you'll see that it is as short and as succinct as possible. The last thing we want to be able to do is have staff drowning in pages and pages of guidance, because obviously it just won't get read. I think the total or the final pages were 13 or 14 pages long, which isn't too bad when the sections are well documented and referenced, so you can just go to the area that you need help on, whether it's how to respond, how to speak to a child, more details on the NRM, and then Hannah's tied it off nicely with, you know, the local training that's available to everyone in this meeting who can come along on a multi-agency basis. And I want to pass special thanks on to Leslie Clark and Annabelle Turner, who co-chair the thematic group who push this work forward. Huge amount of work's gone in the background, very committed professionals that I'm lucky to work alongside. So huge thanks to those two for pushing things forward. The last thing I wanted to say was just to thank you all. Over 100 and I think 118 we're up to at one point has come along today to really engage in the event. It was obviously set out as an awareness raising event, but you can see in the comments that folk have really engaged, taken lots of things away to share with colleagues. We've had really interesting points up about, you know, what is the next step. But like Leslie touched on, the first step always has to be to raise awareness about this issue, try and understand it, and then move on into how we're tackling it. So really want to thank you all for taking 2 hours out of your diary this morning to come along, share your experience, ask questions, get involved, and I'm really glad that we're getting comments in that's been really beneficial, because there'll be certainly a lot more of these in the future, and hope that we can try and get some of them back face to face as well when circumstances permit. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass back to Hannah for any final questions from anyone, but again, just from myself and Sheena and everyone at the CPC, a huge thank you for everything today.
Thank you, Stuart. Yes, does anyone have any last questions either for myself or any of the other trainers that have spoken this morning? Nope, stunned silence. Hopefully that's a good thing. Hopefully you've got so much information now that we've answered all your questions. Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, so any final questions for me? Maybe put your hand up and I'll see if anyone wants me to unmute them. Leslie.
Yeah, can I just, I know we've just got a couple of minutes, Hannah, can I just to reiterate again, you know, the comments that were made before about, you know, we've now got this guidance. We obviously, you sit on the group as well, and you know, we sit on this multi-agency group, which is the best forum for taking things forward. So if anybody out there has got ideas that they think within their service, right, we need this, we need that, and that might be the forum for it, you know, to take to CPC or to develop. You know, Hannah, you know, yourself, we're always inviting members into the group that, you know, that can speak about, whether it be, I don't know, you know, somebody spoke earlier about some sort of guidance packs for foster carers, etc. So just if anybody out there does have, you know, suggestions or would want to dip into the group for, you know, whatever reason, then just get in touch with us and let us know.
Yeah, very, very good point. I think we're always looking for new members and just getting a bit of fresh insight. I think is a fair term. So especially, yeah, with like, I think that's a great idea about the information packs, but I think we certainly wouldn't do badly from getting some fresh blood into the CSE subgroup, just to kind of give us some ideas on how that could be disseminated, what those would look like. So yeah, very, very good points there from Leslie. Has anyone got any other questions for me before we end today's training? Oh, sorry, launch event. Who's this? Who's got their hand up? Catriona, do you want to come off of mute?
Yes, it was just a small question I had that I'd put in the chat, that was just wondering about children that we're not so aware of, like the ones like that are maybe already in travelling communities. I just wondered how could they be tracked and monitored? Because they're already quite closed to, you know, outside interference and hard to monitor.
I don't know that I'm the best person to answer this, and any other speaker who's maybe got an answer for Catriona, please feel free to come off of mute or put your hand up. But I think travelling communities have always been very, very difficult to track when it comes to child protection, because they do move around. So I certainly just hope that with more multi-agency practitioners becoming more aware of trafficking and all the different forms and the situations it can happen in, we would maybe be able to spot that sooner should we be working with someone from the travelling community, and be able to intervene quicker, especially if they are actually still on the move and moving away. Hopefully something can be done sooner rather than later, be that we put in an NRM form or we flag to social work that we have these concerns, maybe sooner than we currently are. But it's always a tricky one with travelling communities because they travel. Has any other speakers got any points they want to make on that?
Yeah, just popping on. I've worked with a few potential victims that have came through the NRM who have been in the travelling community. It is quite difficult to work because obviously they are moving all the time, but within the NRM, and if they're getting supported by the NRM, it is a good way to track and identify and provide the support that's required at that time. So I guess the awareness of the NRM and awareness of spotting the signs is helpful in this, in that type of people group as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both. I can see we've got another hand up from Brett. Do you want to come off mute?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. I think what's important is that there's education across our systems, including within schools, which I know is particularly difficult now. If we could educate young people to understand what we mean by exploitation and trafficking, it may educate young people to avoid being exploited at a much younger age. And I guess even for our older young people, 18 plus, if we could educate them to help understand what you're actually doing is exploitative and dangerous, and it will be dealt with very harshly, and quite rightly so. I think that would be helpful, because sometimes people involved in crime, and I know they say that you know, not knowing the law is no excuse for criminality. I think we really need to help people understand how to avoid being a victim, and of course how to avoid actually being unintended perpetrator of very serious offences.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, Brett. I think it's so hard getting any new stuff on the curriculum in schools as it is, just because it's so tightly packed with stuff that they have to cover. I certainly, when I was in the Green Light Project, struggled for 3 years to get into every school, be that primary or academy in the city and Shire, and try and hammer in how important it is that we're talking about online safety and exploitation, and it's just very, very tricky, because obviously all the schools have slightly different structures, they're governed slightly differently, so it is tricky. But I completely agree. I think prevention's always best, and that if we can get this into, even, you know, in the right ways, primary schools, maybe P6s and P7s, and start those conversations early, we can't be doing any harm, we can only be doing good. But it's just how we go about that, and certainly something that we can, and I believe have discussed in the past in the CSE subgroup. Okay, thank you, Brett. Is there anything else before we end today's launch event? Anyone want to come back in or ask any final questions? No? Okay, well, thank you so much. If no one else wants to come back in, I will, I think when I leave, because I'm the organiser of this meeting, it will end for everyone. But thank you so much for joining us this morning. I hope you found it interesting. We've certainly had lots and lots of good conversations happening in the chat box. Really a lot of food for thought, certainly for myself, especially as a trainer. So thank you so much for joining us. Really good turnout. And yes, any further questions, please feel free to contact me and I can divvy that question on to other trainers or, speakers if I feel they could answer that question a bit better. But thank you so much for your time and have a lovely rest of your day. All right, thank you. Goodbye.